Welcome everyone. My name is Colin Summerhauser. I am the head of HanaHaus in Palo Alto. Today we're super excited to be hosting a collaborative event with the Global Scaling Academy. Could not be more excited for our special guest speaker today. But before I introduce him, I did want to start off by talking about what HanaHaus is in case you guys are not familiar. So for those of you who may not know, HanaHaus is a flexible co-working space and cafe. We have locations in both Newport Beach and Palo Alto, and we are actually a subsidiary of the global software company SAP. And we sort of serve as SAP's community-facing initiative with the goal of bringing people together to explore and exchange ideas in a community atmosphere. And as part of our mission, we host free events with renowned thought leaders every month on different topics as a way to engage our community. And usually these events would take place in person in our physical space. But due to the current situation with the pandemic, we have converted all of these events into virtual experiences. So if you're interested in checking out any of our other events, you can see our full lineup at hanahaus.com/events and register there. Now, interestingly enough, our special guest today, Chris Ye, has been a HanaHaus regular for some time now. I'm not sure if anyone remembers this, but we actually hosted Chris at HanaHaus Palo Alto back in 2019 for a fireside chat as part of the SAP speaker series. And what's funny is back then, Chris had told me how he was going to start a Blitzscaling academy. And I was like, wow, that sounds super interesting. I hope it works out. And now fast forward 2 years, and here we are again hosting Chris as he talks about Blitzscaling and this global scaling academy that he went on to co-found. So Chris confirmed is a man of his word, and we are absolutely ecstatic to have him back today. For those of you who do not know Chris, he is a best-selling author, investor, and serial entrepreneur. He's had a ringside seat in the world of startups since 1995. He's the co-author of Blitzscaling, the lightning-fast path to building massively valuable companies. And his work has even been featured in publications like the Harvard Business Review and TechCrunch. And today he joins us as a special guest to deep dive into this concept of Blitzscaling, which is a technique of prioritizing speed over efficiency in the face of uncertainty. And I think for our audience today, this topic will be especially relevant given the ever-changing landscape of the business world over the past year. Now, I must warn you in advance, Chris is extremely interesting to listen to, and I'm sure you will have questions for him throughout. So feel free to use the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen to submit those questions. And at the end, we will finish off with a live interactive Q&A session. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Chris onto the virtual stage. Chris, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Colin, and I am very much looking forward to being back at HanaHaus soon. I've been telling people for the past few days, even before the announcement from President Biden, that we would likely be able to get back to mostly normal lives by around June 1st of this year. So I hope that when June 1st dawns, I will be over at HanaHaus drinking some Blue Bottle coffee. Perhaps my co-panelist and co-founder, Jeff Abbott, might even be there with me at that point. So we're definitely looking forward to that. I do also think that this is a great time to talk about the topic of blitzscaling because of the fact that I think that as the pandemic recedes, as vaccinations proceed, especially here in the United States, we are going to see a major economic boom towards the second half of this year as the pent-up savings and demand for all those things that people have been denied are going to just spill out. There's going to be economic growth. It's going to be like the Roaring '20s packed into a matter of a few months. So I think it's a great time for people to consider whether or not they have an opportunity to blitzscale. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to give you guys an overview of blitzscaling. It'll be relatively quick because we have a lot of cool stuff to share with you today. And then what I'll do is I'll bring up my co-founder of the Global Scaling Academy and Blitzscaling Academy, Jeff Abbott, to talk about some of the tools we have available. So if you like the idea of blitzscaling, you'll actually be able to begin to apply the tools yourself. And if there's time and technology cooperates, we may even do a little interactive back and forth. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start my screen sharing, and let's go through blitzscaling. So when we talk about blitzscaling, it really is about this incredible pace of growth. So I often ask audiences, would you like to have your company grow 50x in terms of employees, 94x in terms of customers, and 322x in terms of revenues in just 3 years? And in fact, these are real numbers. That's the growth rate that Amazon experienced between 1996 and 1999. And it went from being what was essentially a small online bookstore with revenues of $5 million into the world's e-commerce leader at $1.6 billion. Again, just in 3 years. And that's a position of leadership that Jeff Bezos and Amazon have not relinquished since. And obviously they've gone on to do amazing things. But they got their start through the power of blitzscaling. Now, blitzscaling, of course, is a word that comes from a best-selling book my co-author Reid Hoffman and I put together and published back in 2018. You probably know Reid very well as the co-founder of LinkedIn and as a very famous investor at Greylock Partners. But what you may not know is that he's actually been involved in generating over $1 trillion of market cap and counting. Actually, I need to update this slide because this was done before the Airbnb IPO. That $20 billion down there should be $100 billion. And that PayPal $220 billion should be about $300 billion. So the hits just keep on coming. And amazingly enough, throughout his career, Reid has been creating companies and building companies with these kinds of outcomes. And what we did is we took those lessons and put them into blitzscaling. Now, what we define as blitzscaling is the pursuit of rapid growth by prioritizing speed over efficiency in the face of uncertainty. The pursuit of rapid growth, that's something that pretty much everyone wants. Nobody ever says, I want to stagnate until my company dies. But prioritizing speed over efficiency in the face of uncertainty, that is a little risky. It sounds kind of scary. And the question is, what are the circumstances under which you need to do it? Well, here's a great example. In 2002, this was almost 20 years ago, there was a pivotal moment after the dot-com crash where there was a tremendous opportunity for a little company called Google to blitzscale. They signed a deal with AOL to power AOL search results and sell little text ads next to those search results. Now, the nature of the deal that Google did with AOL was very interesting. Google agreed to do everything. They would run the search engine, they would sell the ads, and they would hand 85% of the proceeds to America Online. Now, not only was America Online getting the lion's share of the money, they were also getting a guarantee. Little Google guaranteed them $150 million a year in payments. Now, this took place at a time when Google had less than $15 million in the bank and had revenues of $19 million the previous year. So this was an aggressive commitment. It was pretty risky. It was pretty inefficient because they were giving up so much. But of course, we know that Google didn't go bankrupt. We know that this worked out great. And in fact, this deal propelled Google to the lasting leadership it holds today. The year before, they had revenues of $19 million. The year after, they had revenues of $347 million. That's incredible growth in just 2 years. And that growth took place because of the AOL deal. And despite paying AOL just colossal amounts of money, it allowed Google to grow and become the giant that it is today. So the big question, of course, is how do I know when to take that risk? Because when you lay it out and think about the risk the Google founders are taking on, it sounds like, wow, is that crazy? I mean, are they just rolling the dice? Well, no. You need to have a certain set of circumstances that says this is the right time to blitzscale. And when it comes to blitzscaling, there's companies like Wework, which demonstrate very clearly that no amount of money can allow you to blitzscale successfully if you have the wrong business model. Wework, of course, has taken in over $15 billion and just lost money hand over fist, and of course has been sadly affected by the pandemic as well. So how do you avoid being a Wework? How do you avoid losing $15 billion? Well, we like to draw on the principles of the great race car driver Ricky Bobby from Talladega Nights. The time to blitzscale is when you're in a Ricky Bobby market, which is to say, if you ain't first, you're last. So what are the things that go into that? Well, to blitzscale successfully, there's a set of necessary elements down at the bottom here. These are things like a big market and product market fit and high gross margins. Again, it doesn't have to be high gross margins today, but eventually, because every company needs to make money and you need the ability to scale the operations and scale the organization. We call these necessary but insufficient. They're necessary because if you want to generate the kind of cash that a $100 billion company generates, you're going to need to have them there. But they're insufficient because a lot of companies have these factors. In fact, every successful company has these necessary elements. So they have to be there to successfully blitzscale, but they have to be there for any successful company. Just having them doesn't mean you're blitzscalable. That's where the essential elements come in. The winner-take-most market is the key dynamic we're looking for, that Ricky Bobby market. And that's usually because of network effects, which means that as the network of users or customers grows, the value of the product grows for each individual customer to the point where new entrants can come in, give their product away, or maybe even bribe you to use it, and they won't gain traction. Sometimes there can be a different kind of land grab. It might be a contractual land grab, or it might be something where you get built into the infrastructure itself. So for example, if you think about something like the shale oil and gas boom, there, shale oil and gas companies buy mineral rights. They lease the mineral rights for 99 years. That's a contractual land grab, a literal land grab. And so those were cases under which blitzscaling also made sense. Finally, you need to have scalable distribution because, as I mentioned, the goal is to get to scale, to be the first to reach scale, to trigger a critical set of sustainable competitive advantages that let you win the market and then keep that market as your province and just go ahead and print money for decades. And to get there, you need scalable distribution. Ideally, you have something like virality to drive exponential growth, or you have the ability to tap existing distribution networks, or preferably both. Because ultimately, the most important thing to do when you're blitzscaling is to be the first person to reach critical scale, to cross that finish line like Ricky Bobby. So assuming that you're going to do blitzscaling, the things that you're then going to figure out are the stages of blitzscaling. Within blitzscaling, as your company grows, it's growing really rapidly, a lot faster than a traditional company might. And so as your company is going through these stages, the company is fundamentally changing from stage to stage. A 20-person company is very different from a 2-person company. A 200-person company is different from a 20-person company, and so on and so forth. Now, when a company is growing at a conventional rate, there's time to adjust to those changes. But if you're blitzscaling, you might go from one stage to the next in just 1 to 2 years. In other words, you're completely refactoring the company every 1 to 2 years. So it's quite a strain. But if you know that it's coming, you as an entrepreneur or business leader are going to be better prepared for it. The other things you need to prepare for are the key transitions of blitzscaling. Now, what I do when there's a limited amount of time is to use the Q&A feature here. Now, with the Q&A feature, what I want you to do, since you can't use chat, I want you to use Q&A. And let me try to pop this up. And what I want you to do is to, in the Q&A, say which of these you would like me to cover. So just name it in the Q&A. We'll take a basic poll within the Q&A and decide which ones. And let me just make sure I'm able to pop open the Q&A section for myself. All right. So go ahead and ask in the Q&A. And it looks like what I'm going to talk about this time, and this is an interesting one. Oh, it's surging and surging. It's going fast. Wow. People are really engaged. I love it. All right, so I'm actually going to ask Colin or Jeff. For some weird reason, I can't get the Q&A to come up for me. You guys tell me who's in the lead. I only see the little number going up.
Okay, so Chris, it looks to me like small teams to large teams is in the lead.
Fantastic. So let's do small teams to large teams. So it's pretty obvious that your company is going to go from a small team to a large team. But what's not as obvious is the fact that that's true even at a larger company. Like even regardless of the growth of your company itself, the individual teams that are in existence are going to go bigger and bigger and bigger. Think about like in the early days, you're in the garage, you're building a prototype with 2 or 3 people. Guess how many people it takes to build a new iPhone? It is a hell of a lot of people. And so you need to figure out how to manage large teams as well as small teams. Now, the reason this is so different is if you think about it, a small team with 2 or 3 people, they can just sit next to each other, or maybe in this case, just be on Zoom all the time and communicate in a very informal way. But if you have a large team, if you've got like 100 people that you're overseeing, you can't do that. You need to have a much more formal structure with multiple layers of hierarchy and with some way of actually getting the word out to all the members of the team, regular all hands meetings, an email that you send every week. So managing a large team is qualitatively different than managing a small team, and you have to be prepared for that particular transition. Now, the other thing, we're going to run the same drill again, is we have these counterintuitive rules of blitzscaling. Blitzscaling is very counterintuitive. You're prioritizing speed over efficiency. That sounds kind of weird, but that means that there's a whole bunch of other counterintuitive rules you need to follow. So take a look at these counterintuitive rules. I'll ask you to do the same thing. Enter into the Q&A the different counterintuitive rule that you would like to see. And I'll again call upon Jeff or Colin, as the numbers of people in the Q&A go up, to tell me which one seems to be in the lead. So take a moment now, go to the Q&A, and tell us which counterintuitive rule you'll hear about. By the way, the book, Blitzscaling, available at fine bookstores everywhere, Amazon, etc., contains explanations of all the key transitions and all the counterintuitive rules. So if you're like dying, you're like, I didn't get to hear about the one I really wanted to, it's all there in the book. Trust me on this. So I see a bunch of people are going. We're going to let it go for another 5-10 seconds because I see the surge. Okay, we just surged up to 21, 22. Wow, this is good stuff. I love the way that things are growing so quickly. So Jeff, maybe if you could take a moment right now to tell me who is in the lead.
So it looks like it's an almost tie between launch a product that embarrasses you and do things that don't scale.
All right, so let's cover do things that don't scale, because that is something that is so important. All of them are important, but with do things that don't scale, the insight here is that oftentimes you're tempted to say, well, let's figure out how we can really make this scalable. Let's figure out how we can build for the future and plan for 5 or 6 years away. Well, the problem with that is that in terms of blitzscaling, you have these different stages, and what succeeds at one stage doesn't necessarily succeed at the other. You're so locked in this battle with your competitors. You're racing and racing and racing. The most important thing is to win the current stage. And usually that means doing things that don't scale. You hack it in order to get the results as quickly as possible, to grow as quickly as possible, and then you fix it later. The classic example that we use in the book is the example of Airbnb. So Airbnb, obviously hugely successful $100 billion company, but in the early days, it was a tiny little company with a couple of founders and barely any customers. And they were trying to figure out why so few people rented apartments. And what they realized is it turns out that most people who own apartments are pretty crappy photographers. And so when they put the photographs of their homes up, they didn't look very appealing. So they're like, we need professional photographers. So what they did was not something scalable. The founders flew to New York, where most of the hosts were. They borrowed cameras from their friends, and they went door to door to each of the hosts and took photos themselves. This is hands-on, the founder doing it themselves, the CEO doing it themselves. Now that obviously doesn't scale, but it was the fastest way to say, okay, is this effect we're seeing real? If we do this, will it improve our business? And it turns out it did. So the next step was, all right, well, how do we scale up from here? Because obviously the founders can't spend all their days going and photographing apartments. So they had a bunch of friends from design school who were good photographers. They said, okay, we'll pay you $50 to photograph an apartment. And so they had a spreadsheet, and they tracked the people that they sent to which apartments. And then when they emailed them the photos, they're like, okay, we got this in. All right, let's PayPal them $50. So they did all this via spreadsheet, and then the founders were like, wow, this is still a lot of work. So they found a summer intern, and they told her, it's your job to keep the spreadsheet up to date and send out the payments. And she did that until at the end of the summer, she was spending more than full time just trying to keep up with the spreadsheet. And it was only at that point that they actually developed software to begin automating this. And the reason is, if you started up front building software to automate the process, first of all, it would take a long time. It would slow things down. Second of all, you'd build the software without necessarily knowing how things would work. And so you'd have to inevitably change it later. And those changes would take longer than building it from scratch because you already made certain assumptions about how things worked. So by doing things that don't scale, by deferring that decision, they were able to achieve the desired result more quickly and ultimately have something that was more scalable and more suited towards the task. But excellent, excellent point. So just a couple more things before we go into how we actually do grade blitz scalability. Responsible blitz scaling. One of the things I always do with audiences like this is make sure I emphasize to you that blitz scaling is a tool. It is neither good nor bad. It is up to you as founders to use it responsibly. And I think we've seen, just in terms of the impact of things like social media, where things that we blitzscale and grow and build can have negative effects as well as positive effects. Blitzscaling is really something that depends on the infrastructure of society. The reason we're able to blitzscale in the United States is because we have this amazing infrastructure, and what you do with your company should help, not harm that infrastructure. I think we're also seeing that if you're responsible and you self-regulate, you reduce the risk of punitive government regulation later on, something that I fear that some big tech companies are going to discover, much to their dismay. And so the way you do this and the way you're responsible is you really consider what kind of risk you're running for society. And the lens you should look at is uncertainty, severity, scale, and fallout. Because if it's relatively mild, if you have a known, mild, narrow, and isolated risk, pretty easy to manage, no problem. Go ahead, do it, fix it later. If you have an unknown, severe, broad, and systemic risk, for God's sakes, don't take that chance. That's like one of those people doing something that could potentially destroy the world. So use those lenses to assess just how risky each risk is so that you can figure out what you should do as a responsible blitzscaler. And when you have figured out that there is this thing you need to respond to, you can decide whether you take decisive action now, take short-term action now, or permanent action later, or just note the problem now and commit to action later. This is the principle that we talked about before, calling let fires burn. The thing you have to keep in mind is what things, if I don't fix them now, will be impossible to fix at scale. Because if they are impossible to fix at scale, obviously you got to do them now. Even if they're difficult to fix at scale, you may still decide that in the interest of speed, you need to defer it. But if it's impossible, you got to take care of it. There's things like building a diverse team from the beginning, because the further along you get with a non-diverse team, the harder it will be to add diversity later on. So that is my very quick 20-minute overview of blitzscaling. I think what we can do is we can take a few moments for questions and answers at this point, and I will stop my screen share so that you can see the questions, so I can see the questions and answers hopefully, and then we'll turn into the second half where we're going to go over some of these blitzscaling tools. All right, now I can see the Q&A now that I'm not sharing the screen. So take a moment and ask any additional questions you guys are interested in, what kind of advice you have. And I see there's one at the very beginning. We'll start with that one from an anonymous attendee who says, what advice do you have for folks in the nonprofit social sector seeking to blitzscale? What of your work does and doesn't apply? Awesome. So this is a really good question. So when we talk about blitzscaling, most people think about it in the context of a for-profit startup, and that's because a for-profit startup, it's easier to raise money from venture capital to scale up and to do all these different things. It is often harder to blitzscale in the nonprofit or social sector, but there are things that you can do in order to make that work. So first of all, if you can find sources of massive funding, usually government funding, possibly foundation funding, that's great. But you know what? Everyone is looking for those, and that can often be very difficult to do. So the other thing you can do is to find ways to cleverly have other people provide the resources you need. One of the examples we give in the book is an organization called Dress for Success. Dress for Success is a nonprofit that was started by a woman named, what is her name again? Nancy Lublin. And what happened with Dress for Success is she decided she wanted a nonprofit that would help underprivileged women get professional wardrobes so that they could interview for jobs, get better jobs, and make a better life for themselves. And Dress for Success basically set up these Dress for Success stores with the donated wardrobes where women would come in and be helped so they could have a wardrobe for their job interviews. Well, there were two key resources that they needed. Well, three technically. The first was the clothes themselves, and Nancy was good at doing that because she had a lot of rich friends on Wall Street who were always, had clothes that were now out of fashion and could be donated. But the second thing is she needed someone to staff the stores, and she needed some source of customers, which women needed the help. And so what she did is she actually partnered with women with shelters that served women who are victims of domestic violence. And what those shelters did is they were able to filter and bring in women who really could use the services of Dress for Success. And so they handled that bringing in of the quote-unquote customer. And then in exchange for being able to have their clients be helped by Dress for Success, they also provided volunteers to staff the stores. So that was an example of how Nancy was able to tap into these existing resources that were already there through another party to be able to grow quickly. As they were able to grow, not dress for success, using a franchise model. And by the way, when you don't need to make money, you can easily franchise. You can say, you don't have to think, oh, if I franchise, I'm giving up control and ownership. You're not giving up ownership of anything. You're a nonprofit. So she was able to franchise, bring in enthusiastic people who loved the model, and they were able to spread it ultimately around the world. So that's a great example of how you can blitzscale as a nonprofit or in the social sector. You can even do it in ways that are different than a for-profit company. All right, so there are a couple of other questions. So I'm going to answer these two more questions. One's from Jackie, who says, how can a company that's not in a mega market grow really fast? So you can grow quickly in a non-mega market, but what you need to do is you need to scale your blitzscaling activity accordingly. So when we talk about full-scale blitzscaling, being willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, you need to have a giant market, a $10 billion, $100 billion, $1 trillion market in which to grow. Otherwise, you can never really justify and earn back the money. In contrast, if you have a small market, so let's say this is the way the world typically worked, right? Let's say there was a small town, and within that town, you were the top restaurant, just as an example. And you can only grow so much. Like if you took that restaurant, you raised $100 million, and you're like, I'm going to market this restaurant to everyone in the town. Yeah, you'd probably get them in. In fact, you could just pay for free food for the townspeople for the rest of their lives. But that's not a big enough market to justify it. So you scale the investment you make based on the size of the market. So even if you're in a small market, you can still grow faster than competitors. But again, the goal is there really that winner take most market? If you can become the top dog in that particular town, then it may very well be worth it. Here's a great example of a very small scale business, although perhaps bigger than most, which did this. Here, I live in Palo Alto, which is famously one of the most expensive places in the world. And there is a very famous realtor here named Ken DeLeon. And what Ken DeLeon did is he decided that it was possible to turn real estate, being a real estate agent in Palo Alto, into more of a winner-take-most market. Now, this seems crazy, right? This is not how real estate works. But what he did is he realized that there was a way to change the game. And that what he did was he courted he was the first realtor in Palo Alto to really focus on and court the extremely wealthy Chinese buyer of houses, because you would have these extremely wealthy people in China who'd made their fortunes, who were looking to get some of their money out, who viewed Palo Alto real estate as both a brand premium and something that was a safe store of value and someplace where they might want to live. And so he began selling that way. And so he actually did things like buy a private jet so he could take people around it, or a private plane. I think it was just a propeller plane. A private plane. He would charter jet flights to bring rich people, or more likely their assistants or chiefs of staff, to Palo Alto, where they would then drive them around in limousines to see the various houses and buy them. All these things cost money, but it allowed him to dominate this market. By the way, he also had staff on the ground in China advertising these things. So because Palo Alto real estate is so expensive, he was able to spend a lot of money. It wasn't $100 million, but it was probably $1 million. But it allowed him to really capture this market. And today, De Leon Real Estate is still the biggest real estate broker here in Palo Alto, even though Ken, I believe, is retired and living on a private island somewhere. Question from Raul. Raul's question is, what do you do if you have a SaaS product ready to explode, but you do not have the financials in place to scale up because you do not sell anything yet? How do you best bridge the gap between receiving income and scaling up your team? So this is a really tough one. So oftentimes, when it comes to raising money from investors, you don't necessarily need to have revenue traction, but you need to have some other kind of traction. If you need to be able to raise money, you got to demonstrate some traction. Now, it doesn't have to be in terms of revenues. It could be in terms of people using your SaaS product and demonstrating that they're using it on a daily basis. If a small number of people are enthusiastically using your product, you may still be able to raise money. When Slack raised its Series A or Series B, depending on how you define it, really their first round as a company, because they originally began as a video game company, they had zero revenues. But what they did have is they had enthusiastic customers who are using the product more and more every day. And having that kind of deep intensity of usage can sometimes allow you to raise money, even if the revenues haven't been there yet. All right, great. So I've just talked a whole bunch, and we're exactly at the half-hour mark, which means it's time to turn to the second half. Thank you again, everyone, for all the questions. And if we have time, we'll come back and do more questions at the end. With that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn things over to Jeff, because we're going to show you some of the tools so that you don't just have to take what you took down and wrote down as notes and say, okay, now I have to apply it. We're actually going to show you how to apply the ideas of blitzscaling.
Thank you very much, Chris, and what a great job getting through this so quickly. And as Colin noted at the beginning, Chris promised in 2018, when he first presented Blitzscaling at HanaHaus, that we would turn it into tools that were available to everyone. And that's exactly what we want to showcase with you all today. So there's actually two sets of tools. One is the Blitzscaling Toolkit, which is a paper-based version that can be downloaded from the website at globalscalingacademy.com. First, we're going to walk you through that tool and show you how to use it to evaluate the scalability of your company. And if at the end of this session, one or several of you want to get feedback on the scalability of your company in real time, we'll direct you now to the website blitzscalabilitygrader.com. I'm going to put that into the chat so that you can see that, if I can find the chat here. And anybody that wants to get feedback in real time from Chris about their company can go ahead and do that. And
There's
we
no
will come
chat.
back to that at the end.
There's no
so first
chat.
I'm going to,
You're gonna
sorry?
have to put it, there's no chat button, so you're gonna have to put it in the Q&A.
Okay, I'll put it in the Q&A. So let's see, where do I do that?
Actually, no. The Q&A won't show for them. What you can do is you can take the URL, you can put it onto a Word document or something like that, and you can share your screen so they can see it. They won't be able to click it, but they'll be able to see it very clearly.
Okay, I'm going to do that straight away.
So meanwhile, while you're doing that, I'll answer one more question, which is Beth asked, if Blitzscaling is a tool, what is the why for using it to grow, and why is Blitzscaling and rapid growth important? So the reason Blitzscaling is important is when you're in one of these winner-take-most markets, if you choose not to Blitzscale, your competitors might. And if they achieve critical scale first, it won't matter if your product is somewhat better. It won't matter if there are things around the edges why people would want to use you. They're just going to end up using that tool that reached critical mass. And we see this all the time. Many people have said, for example, that Betamax was better than VHS. It didn't matter. VHS got to scale first. And so blitzscaling is necessary whenever you're in one of these winner-take-most scenarios. And again, it's not a question of choice. Now, you could always choose not to blitzscale, but if somebody else blitzscales and captures the market, then you're forever locked out. There are times, though, that companies become vulnerable, because the thing is, people will say, well, gosh, does that mean that these blitzscalers are undefeatable, that there's no way to ever take control away from them? The answer is no, of course not. Once upon a time, people would say that IBM was the only technology company that ever exist. And then people would say Microsoft would be the only one. And so what happens is companies can become vulnerable. They may decide that they get complacent. So WebEx got complacent and Zoom came and took their market away. Or what they do might be less important. So Microsoft still has a dominant franchise in the desktop operating system, but they failed to capitalize on this new mobile operating system. And that's one of the things that Bill Gates calls his biggest mistake. So that's why you want to blitzscale. Even somebody like Microsoft, one of the most profitable, valuable companies in the world, failed to blitzscale in an important area and finds itself in a poorer strategic position as a result.
Okay, we're ready to go. And so I'm going to share my screen now and introduce the Blitzscaling Toolkit. And so if you're interested in getting real-time feedback, go to blitzscalabilitygrader.com and complete the tool. It'll show up on the back end, and then we can simply ask in the Q&A, if you've got a business that you want us to quickly comment on before the end, just type the name of your business there and we'll be able to find it in our administration panel. So the Blitzscalability Grader tool is based on the Blitzscaling Toolkit. And again, this is a download that's available at globalscalingacademy.com. And what we did was we took the executive summary, which is also available for download on the website, and modeled the exact path that the book follows. So the book covers 3 different sections. One is business model innovation, the next is strategy innovation, and the third is management innovation. And so in this first section, business model innovation, the canvas is designed to walk you through all the critical questions that you would need to ask about the scalability of your business to help determine whether or not blitzscaling is a good fit for you. So here on this first page of the canvas, which is section 1 of the toolkit, the question here is, How fast should you scale? Should you blitz scale? Well, if you use this canvas, you'll find out. And what you see over here on the right is it's a 10 by 10 matrix divided into 100 boxes. And there are 7 different categories that are each denoted by the different shading backgrounds. Each one of them has a different point value. So you'll first notice here that network effects and distribution and virality account for the lion's share of the available points, 58 out of 100. Other categories that Chris noted, which are necessary for scalability, but not sufficient for blitz scaling, are market size, gross margin, lack of product market fit, organizational scalability, and operational scalability. And they're over here, and you'll see them clearly as the ones with the lower point values. So in the first box, and we may have time to go through all of these, it's essentially asking you to determine whether or not a network effect could exist or does exist in your current business. So we first start by helping you understand what that is. It's a network effect is something that increases the value to all users of the network as each additional user joins the network. So here you're asked a series of questions, whether or not achieving critical scale provides an enduring competitive advantage for your business, whether it provides a temporary but not permanent advantage, or whether it doesn't provide you one. And so based on your answer, how many points available for each one of those questions, you would take a pencil or pen, or if you're using an iPad, go ahead and shade in the number of boxes. And over here, count the number of boxes out of 29 and place your score over here. So here on the bottom, you can see that 0 to 29 points are available for this. So let's say you went ahead and said, achieving critical scale provides me with some competitive advantage, but it's not permanent. That would lead you to a point score of 3. So you'd share it into 3 boxes and you'd count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You'd end up with 9 points for that, and you place that over here. So continuing on to the next category, distribution and virality. Here we're asking you to look at whether you're a business-to-business play or a business-to-consumer. We want you to answer both questions and rate the strength of your distribution on a scale of 0 to 5, and then choose the higher score. So on section A, we're asking you, how difficult is it for you to acquire new customers? Is it costly and time-consuming, or is it something that gets easier as scale advances? You would again decide which point value to assign to yourself, count the number of boxes, and fill in your score. In section B, how viral is your product or service, and to what extent do you gain new customers from referral? Again, on a scale of 0 to 5, rate yourself, count the number of corresponding boxes here, shade them in, and place your score here, and so on. And so this is really the way the canvas proceeds. And there's a similar section for each one. Market size. And as you can see here, market size only affords 11 out of 100 points. So while it's terribly, terribly important, it's not as important as the first 2 categories that we just viewed. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, count the corresponding number of boxes and shade yourself in. So I'm going to jump forward because the process is quite similar for each one of these, and we'll just review them quickly. So there's gross margin, which is accounting for up to 7 points out of 100. Here we're looking for certainly gross margins higher than 50%, but if you want to be a strong contender in the space of blitzscaling, you should probably be scoring a 4 or 5 here and have gross margins above 70. Now getting into the growth limiters, the lack of product market fit, as Chris discussed, is something that can basically halt your scaling in its tracks. And it's something that you should have ascertained before you raise the capital and decide to blitzscale. So here, you're essentially assessing whether or not there's enthusiasm about your product and whether or not your revenues are accelerating, or if you're still in a place of being a place of unconfidence, really, that doesn't warrant putting the pedal to the metal and going for the Ricky Bobby moment. Growth limiter, organizational scalability. Here, there's up to 5 points available. And here, essentially, you're rating the ability of your team. So if you are the founder or CEO or a member of the C-suite, or if you're just a member of an advisory group or perhaps an investor in another company, evaluate it from your point of view. Whether or not the team has the ability and the necessary resources to scale the organization. And then finally, operational scalability is assessing the technology platform and other infrastructural components of the business that would need to scale, and whether or not the team has the ability and the resources and the model itself lends itself to scalability. When you come to the end of this section, transfer the score that you have assigned to yourself on each of the 7 prior pages and just bring them over here into the corresponding area. And then once again, shade in the respective number of boxes in each section. And what you'll come up with is a space graph that allows you to see how many points you have out of 100. And if you score over 80, as is indicated down here below, you may be someone who should consider blitzscaling. Now, Chris, let's talk through some case studies.
So thank you, Jeff. So let's talk about Wework. I mentioned Wework back at the beginning, and we were really trying to figure out, well, why was it such a bad idea? Could they have known in advance before they spent the $15 billion on the product? Well, what really comes down to the thing that everyone focuses on with Wework is the gross margin. They say this is a company that just loses money hand over fist. And certainly it gets a poor score. It's negative 100% gross margin is horrendously bad. And so it's 0 out of 7. But as you can tell, based on the way that we do the Blitz Scalability, that even though it should disqualify you, doesn't actually impact the numerical score that much. Gross margin is only 7 points. And so the thing that really, really hurts Wework is its complete lack of network effects. And that's the thing. If we look at Wework, we ask ourselves, okay, as more people use Wework, does it make Wework more valuable to folks? Well, Jeff, you're in a co-working space right now, correct?
That's right.
Do you prefer your co-working space to be relatively empty so that you have more room and you don't have to worry about infection, or do you prefer it to be extremely full of people?
Well, you know, funnily enough and counterintuitively enough, I was delighted to find it, but I actually am equally delighted that it's almost empty right now because it's not noisy and crowded, and I'm able to get a great deal without any interruptions.
And of course, that's a problem for the co-working operator, because even though they're glad to have your money, clearly they are not making money under the current circumstances. So that's the thing. The network effect is actually in some ways negative. The more people use a particular Wework, the less likely it is you're going to want to go there because there won't be as much room. It's like saying, oh, if I'm going to go work at a crowded coffee shop and I can't get a table for an hour, what's going to happen? So that's the issue on the network effects. Now, the thing is, people might say, well, that's okay because there's a land grab involved here. After all, Wework has these leases on these fantastic office spaces. That would be true, except for the fact that if you go to a Wework office and you look at that fancy office building, if you look to the left, there's another fancy office building. You look to the right, there's another fancy office building. There's no city in which Wework has a monopoly on nice office space, and anyone who wants to can create a rival co-working facility in any office nearby. So as a result, there's very few land grab elements as well. There is a very mild network effect, very, very mild, in the sense that if Wework has the largest number of locations, it makes it a little easier to sell to mega customers like an Accenture who are global and want to offer space to people all around the world. But it's a very minor effect. The net result is that the overall Blitz Scalability score for Wework is only 52, which is bad, right? For us, 80 or above is what it takes to be considered Blitz Scalable. 52, the answer is, for God's sakes, don't try to Blitz scale this thing. Something that I'm sure SoftBank wishes it heard before it spent $15 billion doing just that.
Which just reinforces the value of using a tool like this and why it's important at any stage of your scaling, because it allows you to conduct a litmus test. Now, if you have ambitions to be a blitz scaler and grow a massively valuable company and you don't score well, this helps you dial in on the areas where you're weakest, and then you can conduct modifications to your business model and experiments and perhaps get yourself onto a path that is more inherently scalable. And that's really what the purpose of the tool is. Incidentally, we're also applying this tool in the very same way as a part of our deal screening for the Blitzscaling Ventures investment fun. So we're eating our own dog food, so to speak.
Yes, and I can tell you what's great about the Blitz Scalability Grader is it's free. I mean, if you look at this, obviously SoftBank should have been willing to pay us $1 billion in order to use the tool because it would have still been cheaper in the long run. But sadly, I don't think Masayoshi Son ever offered us $1 billion to use our tool.
No, but we haven't called him yet either.
That's
so
true.
Here's a quick example of what this looks like if you were to go ahead and score Wework. This is how you would have filled it in. And you would end up with something at the end that looks like this. So this is kind of what it looks like to use the tool. And here's another example of Airbnb, which is a company that scores markedly different. And as Chris noted, has actually increased in value since their recent IPO. So let's talk about Airbnb in the context of this tool.
Yeah, Jeff, the numbers don't seem to be showing up. Maybe advance the slide one more.
Maybe it's just delayed.
It's not showing up. I mean, do you see? Oh, it's on the other side. That's why. Got it.
Yes, it's on the other side.
I had it covered with a Q&A session. I apologize.
It's my nifty design skills that are
very cool. So let's talk about Airbnb for a second. So the key thing about Airbnb is it's a two-sided marketplace with very strong network effects. And the reason you can tell is the fact that if you ever have booked an Airbnb, I know, Jeff, you've done it many times. When you go to book an Airbnb, do you just take the first result they give you?
No, absolutely not. I'm looking for the section of town, the size, the safety of the neighborhood. It's really valuable to me to read the reviews of previous guests to find out, what I might expect. And so there's many factors that go into it, not just price.
Yeah. And so Airbnb has a set of characteristics that make the network effects particularly strong because of the need for selection. That's the need for a lot of different places. It's the fact that the places are all very different. It's the fact that it's a high consideration transaction. It's the fact that it's a large value transaction, hundreds of dollars in most cases. All of these mean that the player with the largest number of rental properties is going to be the one that tends to dominate. It's going to attract the most guests. And then wherever the guests go, that's going to be the place where the people who are thinking about renting houses go. I mean, if you're going to go rent a room in your house, Jeff, are you going to go to Airbnb or are you going to go to one of the smaller places?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, certainly for me, Airbnb is what's going to give me the broadest choice of potential guests and the greatest ability to evaluate their reputation and whether or not they've been good guests. So I think no matter what side of the platform you're on, it provides benefits to you.
Yep. And now with Airbnb, again, the rest of the scores, things like distribution are good, but not great. With distribution, Airbnb benefits a little bit from virality in the sense that guests become hosts and hosts become guests. There's sort of a bleed through on the two sides of the marketplace. And they also did some clever work in the very early days of using Craigslist as a mechanism for improving their distribution. So they did some clever things. Of course, the market is very large. They achieved great product market fit. They have tremendous gross margins as a marketplace. And they have a few issues with organizational scalability just because they need to figure out how to handle the safety issues. Customer service is really important. But in general, this company scores very well, 86 out of 100, making it clearly Blitz scalable. And of course, in the end, it has done just that. It's worth well over $100 billion.
Extraordinary. And so if we were to score Airbnb here, you'd see that they got 29 out of 29 points in network effects, slightly less, a total of 17 out of 29 in distribution and virality. They did very well in their massively global market, which they continue to devour. High gross margins, strong product market fit, a little bit challenged on organizational scalability, as Chris noted, operational scalability, highly so. And so they end up with 86 out of 100. And here's what their canvas would have looked like if you had completed it using this tool. So this is how the Blitzkailing Toolkit gets started, the section on business model innovation. And again, we hope this is useful to you, whether you're working in an accelerator on a company of your own, as a mentor, an advisor, an investor, as a way to evaluate the potential to scale of the companies you're working with. Now, the next step, again, if you want to get feedback before the end of the session, you can do so now or really at any time by going to the Blitz Scalability Grader, which looks like this. Here's the website again down here. And all you have to do is go through and essentially answer the same questions that you would have just have seen on the toolkit, except you're going to answer them online. And what you're going to get is a virtual production of your canvas with the respective scores and some directional feedback based on those scores. So if you'd like to do that, we've got a few minutes left.
One of our audience members, Raul, mentions that he may be getting a server error when he does that. So you should probably run a quick check while that's going on. There was another question that had come in, or a thought that had come in from Raul, and so I thought I might talk a little bit while you were doing that check.
Let us find out.
And there's another question from Ming saying, what is the score for SAP? So that is a fascinating question. So SAP is obviously one of the most successful software companies in the world. It is one of the $100 billion software companies, and it is one of Europe's big success stories. And so the question is, well, what drove it? What allowed it to become so successful? And with SAP, there is this tremendous value that comes from the land grab element. So SAP created this brand new notion of there being a ERP system, right? They created a brand new category. And the thing about ERP is something that is deeply entwined with the operations of your company. So once you choose an ERP system, it is extremely painful to then come around and say, I'm going to choose a different one. Same is true for anything that touches so many different elements of the business. And so with SAP, the original product, the original ERP product really had this strong land grab characteristic. And SAP was one of the first to really define the category and go after the market. And by doing so, was able to be very successful in that area. Now, the thing is, when you build that, eventually a company will stop blitzscaling, which is you capture enough of the market that it no longer makes sense to prioritize speed over efficiency. But then what you do, if you're a company like SAP or Microsoft or what have you, is you look for other ways to actually create new business lines that can blitzscale. The way that companies are successful over time is that they continue to find new ways to blitzscale. So if you're Apple, you shift from personal computers to iPods, to iPhones, to iPads, and so on and so forth. You need to continually bring out new products in order to be successful. Even a company like Amazon, for example, obviously a very big leader in e-commerce, but has also added on things like Amazon Web Services and Amazon Marketplace to be able to be more valuable. So it's really important to not just find your initial blitz scalability, but to continue to find new ways to blitz scale from there. Jeff, how are we doing? Thumbs up, thumbs down?
Well, I do see some new submissions coming in, so I'm not certain why the error message has come, but could you tell me the name of the company?
Raul, whose company is Race.Software, is the person who encountered the problem. I don't know if he was able to get one in.
Race. No, I'm not finding that one. So perhaps there is an issue with the tool.
Well, Raul, we apologize for the technical difficulty.
We apologize.
Get a few other ones in. Again, it's something where hopefully you'll just be able to reach out to us and get in touch. I did check out your website. I thought what you were working on was very interesting. So what Race Software does is it makes it very easy to run simulations on suspensions. And so I do think it's a bit more of a niche market. This is where that question about how do you blitzscale in a smaller market makes sense. You need to figure out how to scale your blitzscaling accordingly. But part of what you want to do is you want to try to become the default mechanism, the default tool for doing these sorts of calculations. And so a lot of it then becomes, how do you build up the ecosystem around you? How do you make it so that the results from Race.Software are plugged into other things so that the stickiness is built up, the moat is built up, and there is a larger and larger network effect. So just a little bit of advice without knowing all the details, just from having looked at the company website. So given that we have a couple of folks who might have submitted, Jeff, maybe we can just pick one and share it and talk about it a little bit, because we're running low on time. We only have about 5 more minutes.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, and again, we apologize for the difficulties with the tool. If you'd like to email either one of us, we'd be happy to follow up with you about your particular company.
Great. Whenever you're ready, and if not, I can answer one more question as well. There's another question that's come in.
So are you suggesting that I share, Chris?
Yes, you should. You should pick one to share, or I can answer another question that's coming in the Q&A. Either way.
Yes, the submissions are not coming into the tool.
Okay, so I'll answer this other question live, and we'll just review what's going on with the tool afterwards. So there's a good question that an anonymous attendee asked, which is, are there any thoughts on times when you're at scale, and if the world and market are changing, you might determine it might be time to close up shop, sort of blitz unscaling. Absolutely correct. So as I mentioned, blitz scaling is not something you do forever. There are key signs that it is time to begin to think about the slowdown process. So oftentimes, this could be something where you see leading indicators that are no longer leading. So one of the examples we use in the book is Twitter. Twitter is a company where the number of users really began to plateau before the revenues plateaued. So the number of users plateaued, the revenues kept increasing because they're getting better at monetizing. But when your core fundamental leading indicator, the number of users plateaus, that's not a good sign. And Twitter kept hiring and kept growing. And then when revenues stopped growing, because guess what? When you have only a certain number of users, you're going to stop growing your revenues. Then all of a sudden they had to lay a bunch of those people off. So don't do that. You got to keep an eye out for the metrics and understand if in fact you're getting to the point where the number of users is slowing down, or the revenues per employee has started to decline. All these signs are signs that maybe it's no longer time to blitz scale. You no longer are capturing more value by growing than you are by managing the decline. And there is an argument for when it's time to blitz unscale. So if we think about it, it's like, well, when would we blitz unscale? Well, it would be circumstances under which the winner take most elements are no longer relevant, or the market size is shrinking. So let's say you're the dominant player in a market, but the market is shrinking. You clearly need to shrink along with it. Now, you might try to develop new markets, new products, and various things, but you cannot take something that is shrinking, a market that is shrinking, and get more money out of it. So there is absolutely a reason to blitz unscale as well as to blitz scale. Colin, I see you're coming on. We're almost out of time.
Yes, thank you, Chris. I think we are at almost the top of the hour, so I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. So I think we could start to wrap up here. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today, and thank you, Chris and Jeff, for taking the time to speak with us. I know for me personally, this topic was super interesting. Given that we are situated in the Silicon Valley, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've watched all of these companies around me just scale at ridiculous speed. So it was awesome hearing your guys' perspective on how they went about doing this. And I know based on all the questions and participation, our attendees found it fascinating as well. Audience members, we will be sending out a follow-up email after this is over, so be on the lookout for that in your inbox. There will be a link to the replay video as well as a survey for you to fill out. And if you can spare a minute, please do take that survey, as we want to hear your thoughts on this session and whether or not you would find it interesting if this became a reoccurring series. And with that, I'll let you guys get back to it. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I look forward to seeing you guys at some of our other events. Thanks so much.